Well, on behalf of Beyond Borders and Triquet House, and may I say also the Scottish Borders, it gives me great pleasure to welcome First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to Triquet House for this important session.
Nicola, it's a delight for me to have you here, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to ask you a few questions. I did an event with Jack McConnell earlier, and for those of you who were at that event, you'll know that I'm not intending to pin you to the wall Jeremy Paxman number. What I want to do is a kind of conversation between the two of us to explore some of the things that perhaps you don't always get an opportunity to explore in conventional media interviews. And of course, we'll open it up to this audience as well, because I know there will be many, many people here who might want to pin you to the wall and ask you some Jeremy Paxman-style questions. Let me start by asking you this. You've been propelled in a very short space of time from being well known in Scotland to having a kind of international celebrity status now, partly because of the way you conducted yourself during the general election campaign, but also you've been abroad. You went, for example, to the United States and appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I watched that on YouTube. I want to start by asking you, how have you handled that celebrity, and what was it like going on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart?
I think the first part of that question is probably for other people to judge, but to be perfectly honest, the experience of the Jon Stewart show was, how can I put this, utterly terrifying. It was one of these things that I was asked to do a few weeks in advance, and I thought, that's a great idea. I will happily do that. I'd love to sit there and be on the Jon Stewart show. And then 24 hours beforehand, found myself thinking, what on earth have I agreed to do? This could be absolutely disastrous. My political career might be about to come to a shuddering end. In the event, I think I got away with it, so it was okay. But that was a surreal experience. Your broader question, though, is true. You asked that question about me as an individual. I actually think what has happened over the past year for Scotland is that the country has been propelled onto the international stage because of the referendum principally, but also events last year like the Commonwealth Games helped with that. Now, what do I think about that? I think it's fantastic. I think it is a massive opportunity for the country, economically, socially, culturally. And I just think we've got to grasp it with both hands. That's what I'm trying to do as First Minister, and I think it's what all of us as a nation should try to do as well. It's a brilliant opportunity.
I know you want to talk about Scotland and not yourself, but I'm going to persist.
It was a valiant attempt, though, don't you think?
I'm going to persist because I watched it on YouTube not long ago, and you handled it brilliantly. I mean, you were funny, you were charming, you got the point across, and one of the things you did was you got Jon Stewart to draw a line between your aspiration for Scottish independence and their experience of 1776, when he said to Nicola, you know what, he takes some advice from us. They don't like it when you drop their tea in the sea. And I thought, actually, that's more symbolically meaningful. Did you have a sense that you were speaking to liberal America about Scotland and independence?
Oh yeah, absolutely. On the Jon Stewart show, I think that's entirely what you're doing. I mean, I would stress that I didn't plan what I was going to say going in there, for the simple reason is there is no way you can plan what you're going to say when you're being interviewed by somebody like Jon Stewart. I mean, my team were in talks with his production team for the couple of days beforehand to try to get a sense of what he might ask me, and the answer to that was, we've got no idea. We brief him on the kind of things that he might be interested in, but then he just makes it up as he goes along. So I had no idea how that was going to go. There was one, I think, lucky break I got in the weekend before, where when the programme was advertising my appearance, on their website, they billed me as a comedian, which at the time added to my sense of terror about the whole experience. But it gave me a good into the programme, and once we got into it, I actually enjoyed it. It was a fun thing to do, but the idea that I had this game plan in my head going into it absolutely couldn't be further from the truth.
You've been in power now in Scotland for 8 years. How do you think Scotland is different from when you... what's improved as a result of the SNP government being in power?
Lots of things. The health service is better today. Waiting times are shorter. I think the education system, I might come on to this a bit more because I passionately want to see our education system get even better, but there have been improvements there.
But it's got worse, hasn't it?
No, I don't think it has, but I'm happy to go into that in detail because I'm passionate about that subject. If you take the economy, we've had as has the whole UK and much of the world, had an incredibly difficult economic experience over the past few years. But women's employment is at the highest level that it's ever been in Scotland. Youth unemployment is at its lowest level in several years. So there's lots of things that have improved against a very, very difficult backdrop. But if you ask me to sum all of that up and say what is different about Scotland today than the Scotland in 2007 that the SNP first took office in, is that we're a much more confident country. We're a much more hopeful country. I think we're a country that's got a much stronger sense of who we are and who we want to be. Of course, there are some significant challenges that we've got to face up to and address, but my optimism about the energy and the enthusiasm and the passion that there is in Scotland to address these things is absolutely huge.
One of the differences between you and David Cameron, Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband.
Can I just say there's lots of differences between me and David Cameron.
But it's the experiences that shaped you all as politicians. They slipped quite easily into safe seats, whereas you fought election after election after election and lost. To what extent did that sense of struggle shape you as a politician?
Possibly that more than anything else, actually. I mean, Jack McConnell, one of my illustrious predecessors as First Minister, is lurking at the back right now. And I remember when he's taking notes. If only you'd done that when you were First Minister and I was Leader of the Opposition, Jack. But I vividly remember, and Jack probably doesn't remember this, but I vividly remember when First Minister's questions, when Jack was First Minister and I was asking him the questions, and in response, I can't remember what the subject matter would be that I was questioning Jack about, but in response, he taunted me about having failed to win a constituency and predicted, wrongly as it turned out, that I would fail again next time round. And that really wounded me and made me more determined that I was going to win next time. So that experience that I had personally of having to come back again and again, learn lessons of defeat, apply those lessons and get better so that eventually I could win, shaped me as a politician probably more than any other single thing. And actually, that shaped the SNP because that's the experience of most people in the SNP, of not finding success easy to come by, of having to really, really work at it. And I believe as long as that's the one thing, amongst many things, that the SNP never loses, then we won't go far wrong. That never taking a single vote for granted, never taking a single person for granted, feeling that every single day we've got to re-earn the trust of the people that elect us, then if we keep it that, then hopefully we'll be in power for many years to come.
One of the things that... Are you gonna do that after every answer?
It's fine by me if you want to.
I'll be like the Speaker of the House of Commons and ban applause. One of the things your opponents say about you is that they underestimated you for a long time. Did you feel underestimated by them?
I think as a young woman in politics, you do feel, well, firstly, you feel underestimated, but you also feel, and this is certainly how I felt in the earlier years of my political career, that I had so much more to prove than many other people in politics, than men, even men of my own age. You just feel that you have got a massive amount to do to prove yourself worthy. The upside of that is that it does make you work harder and really earn your spurs. But yes, I guess down the years, people have underestimated me. They've described me in ways that wasn't particularly flattering or complimentary. But all of that, although it can hurt you and wound you and upset you at the time, I think all of that drives you on. Certainly in my experience, it's driven me on to hopefully be not by any stretch of the imagination a perfect politician. I'm far from that, but a better politician than I was when I first started out.
What you have that seems to me to be unique is you're in a window, you're in a period of extraordinary personal authority and legitimacy. Your party's running at perhaps 60% in the polls, absolutely unprecedented. You can afford now, with this popularity and authority you have, to take some pretty radical decisions that might be unpopular in the short term. What do you think about that? What sort of opportunity does this present?
It's a massive opportunity and a massive responsibility. And, every time I see an opinion poll that says the SNP is at, 50%, 55%, 60%, 62% is the last one was, there's no part of, well, that's not true. There is a big part of me goes, yes. But there is a bigger part of me just feels an incredible weight of responsibility, because that is an enormous opportunity to change this country for the better. Now, we talked briefly about education a moment ago. I set out just this week some intentions around reform of education that mean a great deal to me personally and that I'm absolutely committed to. They won't necessarily be easy to implement. They won't necessarily win favour from absolutely everybody. But I am determined that in the future, Scotland can say with confidence, something that we could say with confidence in generations past, that we've got a world-class education system, that there's no better place in the world to be educated than here in Scotland. Now, I think our education system is good. I think there have been improvements in the past few years, but can we hand on heart right now say it is absolutely excellent and there's no room for improvement? Probably not. So we need to make sure that happens. Gender equality is something else I've put very firmly on the agenda. I think we've got a great opportunity, not just in Scotland, globally, but to lead this here in Scotland, to really not crack the glass ceiling, shatter it to smithereens. So these are the kind of things that I want to lead on, and to be able to look back in a few years' time, however many years I get the privilege of being First Minister, to be able to look back and say, we did tough things, but we did the right things and the country is better for them.
At the moment, you're leading a government within a devolved settlement. Even though what you want is independence, you're getting on with leading a devolved government. You're going to get new powers next year. When the Smith Commission proposals are legislated for, there'll be further new powers. What difference is that going to make to your ability to change this country?
Well, I think every extra power we have in our own hands enhances the ability we've got to make change in Scotland. And, that's at the very heart of, the belief that I and every other Yes campaigner put forward in the referendum, that decisions about Scotland are actually fundamentally best taken here in Scotland. Now, I'm under no illusions that the powers coming, certainly in the 2012 Act and to a lesser extent in the Scotland Bill that's going through the Westminster system just now, are not, by any stretch of the imagination, the full extent of the powers I would like to see us have. I don't think it gives us nearly enough around social security, or indeed nearly enough in terms of what we would do to grow the economy and make the economy thrive even more. But, limited powers over tax, some limited powers also over social security. We will use these to the fullest extent possible. I would say, though, anybody who argues that limited power over taxation is going to be enough to stop the full frontal Tory austerity drive is kidding themselves on. Full control over our own economy is what we need to do that.
Isn't it a bit of a poison chalice, taking responsibility for income tax alone? It's only about 22% of the overall tax take. You will be under pressure from those who support you because of your social justice agenda to squeeze the rich to increase income tax. But it won't actually end up raising very much more revenue to make a real difference. So you'll be damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you raise income tax, you'll make enemies. And if you don't raise income tax, you potentially make enemies as well.
That's kind of the nature of being in government. You're always damned if you do, damned if you don't. There will always be people wanting you to do something, and if you do it, there'll be people who oppose you. I would never ever see the exercise of power or the ability to use power as a poison chalice. With that comes big choices. What is undoubtedly true is that the powers that are proposed right now as a result of the Smith Commission, I think, are lopsided. I think they are transferring powers, more responsibility over spending to Scotland without commensurate powers over revenue raising, and particularly powers that would enable us to grow the revenue base and grow our revenues through greater economic activity. So I think there's a an imbalance in those powers, and overall I think they are insufficient. But we'll use whatever powers we've got as well as we can. And my government, we will get out there and defend and justify and argue for the choices we make, because that's what being in government is all about.
The independence aspiration is based on the assumption that an independent Scotland would, in the medium term, be wealthier because of the ability to use all the macroeconomic powers available to the government of an independent state. Why would an independent Scotland grow more successfully than one devolved inside the United Kingdom? How would that happen?
I've never argued that independence guarantees, as if by magic, that Scotland becomes a more prosperous country. Like any country, it's not just the holding of the power that determines whether you're successful, it's what you do with those powers. So if an independent Scotland had a rubbish government that used those powers wrongly, then there would be consequences of that. What I argue, though, is that there's nothing inherent in Scotland that would suggest that that would be the case. So put those powers into our hands, and I believe there is everything to suggest that we would use them well and creatively and innovatively. And what's the sort of simple suggestion, the simple evidence of that? It's that countries the world over, countries with nowhere near the natural resources that we have, value and would fight for their independence. I don't mean that in a violent sense, obviously, but would passionately defend their independence. You know, I remember being in Dublin during the recession and the financial crash, when people in Ireland were suffering considerably from the economic conditions there, and sort of mischievously saying to a few folk in Dublin, does this experience make them wish that they could go back to being governed by London? And to a person, they reacted with horror. Of course not. They were an independent country, and being independent, whatever the circumstances, was the best way for them to try to shape and influence and chart their own destiny. And that is true of Scotland as well.
A friend of mine in Dublin said to me, it's the first national catastrophe on which we can't blame the British. So it's progress of a sort.
I'm sure they could have found some kind of way there.
Let's. Nicola and I agreed just before we came in here that she'd announce the date of the second referendum. So. No, I'm kidding.
As she starts to shift uncomfortably in her seat.
Let me ask you first of all about something that a referendum we know we're going to have, which is the in-out referendum on European Union membership. How will that change the dynamic of politics in Scotland?
Well, obviously, it depends on the outcome of it. I will be passionately arguing in that referendum that not just Scotland, but the UK should opt to stay within the European Union. Not because I think it's perfect. I don't. I think there's many aspects of it that are ripe for reform. But I think our interests are best served by being within. If we end up in the scenario, which might not happen, but it is certainly not beyond the bounds of possibility, that the UK as a whole voted to come out of the European Union, but Scotland voted to stay in, I think that would undoubtedly have people in Scotland demanding that we look again at whether we should be independent. I've said that before, and I don't think there's any doubt that there would be an appetite in those circumstances to look again at the independence question.
But that would make the independence proposition very different, wouldn't it? Because then there really would be a border.
It would also make the staying in the UK proposition very different as well. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I think it would make a vote for independence guaranteed or inevitable. I'm sure there would be a variety of different opinions at that time. What I am saying, though, is I think it would. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it would have many people saying that that is an option we should at least look at again. Incidentally, I've put forward a proposal that would take away the possibility of this scenario arising, this idea that many federal states, and I know we're not a federal country in the UK, but nevertheless an idea that many federal states embrace of double majority, so that for a UK exit, for a Brexit, there would have to be not just a vote across the entirety of the UK, but a vote for that in each of the component nations of the UK. Because we were told repeatedly during the referendum that the UK is a family of equal nations. Now, if that's true, then here's a chance to prove it.
But in the event of a British exit in which Scotland votes to stay in, you have to change your independence case, don't you? Because you're asking the Scots to choose between two unions then. And it makes the argument for a shared currency with the rest of the UK radically different, doesn't it? I mean, it's inconceivable, isn't it, that a Scotland that's inside the EU could share a currency with a state that was outside it?
I don't think it's inconceivable, but I do accept that many of those debates would have a different dynamic to them. And, you know, that is undoubtedly the case for those who would be arguing for independence, but it would also change the proposition pretty dramatically for those who are arguing for the Scotland to stay within the UK. I'm trying to get at
how what your thinking is about the way you will have to change your pitch.
I'm not. Let me, emphasise this point. I'm not hoping necessarily that this scenario comes about. I'm going to spend a lot of time over the next couple of years arguing very strongly for the UK as a whole to vote to stay in the European Union, because maybe this is one of my faults. I'm not one of these constantly, Machiavellian sort of type politicians that, is always trying to engineer certain scenarios that suit my political purposes, even if I think they're bad for the country. I hope there is a vote in Scotland and across the UK to stay within the European Union. I'll continue to argue the case for Scotland to be an independent country within that context, but I'll argue that case in the upcoming referendum.
But what thinking is going on in the SNP about how the next time you pose this question, whether it's in the course of the next Holyrood Parliament or beyond, about how the case for independence would have to change to win it?
A considerable amount, which is not to say we're currently planning for a second referendum, but it would be strange, would it not, to have just gone through the referendum we've just gone through, and to narrowly fail to win it, but to make considerable progress towards that. I mean, at the start of the referendum campaign, support for independence in polls rarely got above maybe 30%, a third of the vote. Now, to get to 45%, which was not as far as I wanted us to get and hoped we would get, and in the latter stages of the campaign believed we would get, but it was still a considerable distance to have travelled, which suggested that the Yes campaign actually persuaded in the course of that campaign significant numbers of people in Scotland. But it would be strange to have come out of that campaign falling just short, not to be thinking very carefully and in a very reflective way about the things that we might have done better or would have to address differently in future. I'm not going to share all of that with you today.
Even some of it.
Well, I think, centrally to that, and this will bring in a lot of different issues to it, but ultimately, now, don't get me wrong, many people who voted no because they passionately and in principle believed in the United Kingdom, and I respect that. So there are a number of people that we would never have been able to convince because their belief in the UK was as strong as my belief in independence, and that is absolutely legitimate. But there were a lot of people, and I know many of them personally, who in their hearts wanted to vote yes, many of them who perhaps went into the polling station planning to vote yes, but in their heads weren't quite there and couldn't bring themselves to do it. Now, why was that? In a nutshell, that was because they were, call it frightened, worried, concerned, anxious about the implications, particularly economic implications. Now, a whole lot of things would have come into play there, from currency to European Union membership to the fiscal position of Scotland. But what we have to find ways of overcoming is that concern and anxiety, and that will embrace a whole variety of issues in it.
I mean, I was there throughout the referendum campaign, and I know that the big guns were brought out to argue for no. You faced the combined assault of the three main pro-UK parties.
I think they did quite a lot of good for the Yes campaign, to be honest, in the latter stages.
But I'm talking about those people who had that last-minute failure of nerve that you talked about there. We had the people being told their pensions wouldn't be paid. The supermarkets were saying the price of food would go up. We'd have to get in the queue behind Kosovo for EU membership. All of those things, and we can blame all of those campaigns. Operation Fear. We can blame the BBC if you like. But what I'm interested in is whether you think there was something wrong with your own blueprint for independence.
I'm not going to sit here in any campaign that I'm ever part of that is an unsuccessful campaign and say there's nothing wrong with it. Clearly, by definition, it didn't succeed. So there will be all sorts of things. I've thought long and hard in the almost year that it is now since the referendum about all of these aspects, and I'll continue to do so, and the SNP collectively will continue to do so. But I also have a different way of looking at it. You've just gone through there everything that was thrown at the Yes campaign.
Not everything, just some of it.
Just some of it, yeah. The combined might of the three opposition parties, although I'm not sure that's the right way of describing it. The financial services sector, supermarkets, some international pressure that was brought to bear, massive, massive elements of the domestic and international global establishment were brought to bear on this. And yet, despite all of that, 45% of the people of this country had the belief and the optimism and the confidence in this country to vote yes. I think that's something actually to be really proud of, and it's a great foundation now to have.
I ask you these things, though, because you can't really afford to have a second referendum and lose a second time. So you have to judge the timing of the next one very well. Ideally, you'd want to wait, would you, until support for independence was consistently showing upwards of 60%?
Look, I think there will be, at some stage, a second referendum, because I think Scotland will become an independent country. I think that will be in my lifetime. I can't tell you when that's going to be. I tell you something I don't ever want to do. I don't ever want to be part of another losing independence referendum campaign. So when that referendum, I say this repeatedly, and I say it so often because I believe it so passionately. The driving force behind this is democratic public opinion in Scotland, and I mean that in two ways. 55% of people voted no, and we can't just wish that away. So if you're not to disrespect the 55% who voted no, then you have to demonstrate that there has been a proportion of those people who've changed their minds, or there's evidence that there has been a change of mind amongst some of those. But secondly, because I don't want to be part of another losing referendum campaign, yes, I would want to be confident that if there is a second one, there's going to be a yes vote. And not a narrow yes vote, but a significant yes vote. Do I believe that will happen in my lifetime? Absolutely yes.
Are you under pressure to put a commitment to a second referendum in the 2016 manifesto?
Do I look under pressure? No.
There are people in your own party who want that commitment, though.
Absolutely. There will be people, my experience, most people in my party, passionate though they are about independence, are also pragmatic. Just because all of us who voted yes last year are, perhaps because of circumstances, because of the general election result, a majority Tory government are more committed, more passionate, more determined. Well, 45% that is more passionate and more determined and more committed is still fundamentally just 45%. So that is not enough. Just all of us being more determined to be independent is not enough to win a second referendum. We've got to change people's minds. We've got to convince the people in the future that we couldn't convince last year. There's no shortcut to this. Scotland will only be independent when a majority of people in Scotland want to be independent. Yeah, I wish there was a shortcut and a back door to independence. If there was, I would have found it by now and taken it. There's not. There is only the democratic route. So when will that happen? It will happen when a majority want it to happen.
Let's get some questions from you. Who would like? There's one question here, and then down at the front here, two gentlemen down at the front. Yes, sir.
First Minister, I'm aware that issues of asylum and migration are reserved. I wrote to you 2 or 3 weeks ago and was delighted to get a reply within a week from one of your officials. And the point at which I I'm concerned is that the sort of situation we see in Cali and Kos and elsewhere, there are huge concerns about border security and so on, but at heart it does seem to me this is a moral and a humanitarian issue. I'm aware that the UK government has declined to be part of a European scheme to offer refuge within the United Kingdom. Some of these people who are fleeing countries like Syria, about which we've just been hearing. I am also aware from the reply to my letter to you that there has been some discussion between your government and the UK government seeking the UK government to change their policy with this regard. My question is, should that prove ineffective, is there any way that here in Scotland we can accept a reasonable number and an appropriate number of these people who are suffering so dreadfully?
Good question.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for your letter. I'm always relieved when somebody starts their question by saying they wrote to me, to hear it quickly followed up by they got a reply. But no, I mean, seriously, you know, I challenge anybody to watch the scenes that we're seeing nightly on our televisions just now and not, you know, feel their heartbreak at some of those scenes. And I think you are absolutely right to describe this as a moral humanitarian issue. Yes, there are serious issues in, you know, the countries from which people are fleeing that have to be addressed. This is a problem that has to be addressed at source. But that does not mean we can turn our backs and simply watch people perish, children drown in the Mediterranean, and people go through the humanitarian stress and distress that so many people are suffering. I think it's, and I'm not saying anything to you that I won't say to the UK government directly, I think it's pretty disgraceful that the UK is not prepared to play a full part in a European-wide relocation scheme. If that changes, the Scottish Government will be absolutely of the view that we should play our full part in seeking to receive and to cater for an appropriate share of migrants. And we will continue to make that case to the UK Government. Immigration and asylum are reserved matters at the moment, and we cannot operate outside of the UK systems that are in place. But I do believe that we should be, you know, as a country and as a society, we should want to see the way in which we deal with a crisis like this be one of the things that is the hallmark of a civilised, decent society.
What would a full part look like?
Well, you know, in a very you know, kind of numbers-driven way, if the UK was to accept to take a share of migrants, and Scotland would want to contribute a population percentage share of that. And that's a very kind of dry way of looking at it. But what I'm saying, you know, as First Minister, I'm not going to sit and call on the UK government to do things when, as First Minister, would not be prepared for Scotland to play our full part through, you know, because the very practical things you have to provide for those coming, seeking asylum in our country, from health and education and other services. So Scotland would want to play a full part in that. But, you know, the international community, the European community must collectively deal with this much more effectively in the future than it has in the past.
I mean, Germany have taken 800,000. That's one refugee asylum seeker for every 100 people already living in Germany. The equivalent number for Scotland would be 50,000. Would that be appropriate?
Well, look, I'm not going to sit here and put numbers on it in that way. You know, obviously what Scotland does is driven because of the reserved nature of immigration, is driven by the decisions the UK government take. But we have to be prepared to contemplate the action that is required, because what is the alternative to that? In the short term, the alternative to that is to watch a humanitarian crisis that is developing and increasing and deteriorating on an almost daily basis. Now, I know these debates are not comfortable for governments domestically, and I'm under no illusion that there will be, you know, sections of opinion in Scotland who take a very different view to the one I am articulating right now. But for goodness sake, you know, these are human beings we're talking about. They're not statistics, they're not numbers, they're not abstract concepts. These are human beings just like we are, and we've got to find a way of dealing with this.
But if you were the Prime Minister of an independent Scotland, you would have to commit yourself to a number, wouldn't you?
But I'm not the Prime Minister of an independent. So what I'm saying is I I think we should be prepared to take decisions commensurate to other European countries. What I'm saying, though, is that I cannot act outside the UK decision making, and to try to, people who were passionately, not you incidentally, but people who were passionately against Scotland becoming an independent country always want me to say what we would do if we were independent. Whether I like it or not, we operate within these UK frameworks, but we're making very clear our view in these matters, and we'll continue to do so.
Peter.
First Minister, what a wonderful talk you gave
These
us.
are fantastic trousers, Peter. I feel I have to say this.
Anyway, I had actually wanted to raise that very subject, but now I can go to something else. In Britain, there is an enormous shortage of affordable homes, and in Scotland, there is about 150,000 shortage of affordable homes. And not so long ago, Shelter did a very interesting study between housing and well-being, and we really somehow need to address this, and I hope that your government is able to really work with the private sector and see if we couldn't really resolve that problem, because by housing people properly, we will have a much healthier and a much better well-being for our customers.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. I think Scotland's got a very good record on housing provision, but undoubtedly there is much more to do. I mean, this is one area where you cannot divorce the discussion from the economic conditions that have prevailed over the past few years. But in the last election, we set a target as a government of delivering 30,000 new affordable houses over the lifetime of this Parliament, 20,000 of those to be for social rent. We are well on track to meeting that. And as part of being able to meet that, we have worked very innovatively with the private sector to look at different ways of funding affordable housing, and we'll continue to explore different ways of doing that. We also did something that was controversial in many areas, which was to end the right to buy social housing, because if we accept there's a shortage, and if we're going to invest considerable amounts of money in trying to increase the provision of social housing, it simply seems to me to be illogical to allow that housing to leak out of the social rented sector in the future. So we've ended the right to buy, although we have invested money in supporting home ownership in other ways. So our shared equity schemes help to buy. So this is a massive area. We're looking quite closely just now about, assuming we're re-elected next year, what would be an appropriate target for affordable housing for the next Parliament. And there's a number of issues to be brought to bear in that. But you're absolutely right, not just to identify it as a big issue, but to link it as well to health, to well-being, to sense of community, to all of the things that add up to the quality of life that people have.
And the specific thing that Peter mentioned about cooperating with the private sector, how would that work?
Well, I said we've delivered, or on track to delivering our commitment of 30,000. So within that, in order to be able to deliver that while capital budgets have been getting slashed, we've looked at very innovative, and we've been the first part of the UK to do some of this. So we were the first part of the UK to develop what's called the National Housing Trust model, which is the government using guarantees to lever in private sector funding to fund affordable housing. So we've looked at a number of different models of funding, and that's involved partnerships with the private sector, and we're absolutely up for doing more of that. Some other things that are still being looked at is how we use pension fund resources to build more houses. So there's an active amount of work being done around this in the Scottish Government, and I'm absolutely open to ideas if anybody has any about how Peter's nodding that he has some, so absolutely open to thoughts on how we do more of that.
I've got a question here, and then there's a gentleman down the front, and then somebody further back. Yes.
First Minister, we now have 3 women heading up our parties in Scotland. Is that going to make a difference to gendered politics in Scotland, and if so, how will we recognise it?
Well, firstly, you might say I would say this, but I think it is absolutely fantastic that that's the case. And, we talk so much about Scotland being a small country, But, there's something we can go out to the world and brag about, that we now have the 3 main political parties in our country led by women. There's probably no other, I can't think of another country anywhere that can say that. Is it enough? Well, firstly, will it make a difference? Yes, I think it will. For a variety, I hope it won't completely change the tone of politics, but I hope it does so in some ways. It will send a very powerful message, I hope, to young women and wee girls out there who previously might have not been able to visualise themselves in politics, but now can. So yes, I hope it does make a big difference. Is it enough in and of itself? No. We've got to make sure it leads to change in other ways. When I became First Minister, I appointed a gender balanced cabinet. Apparently we're one of only 3 countries in the world, in the developed world, with a gender balanced cabinet, which in one sense is absolutely deeply depressing that there's only 3. But in another way, again, something we should be proud of. But we've got to drive gender equality in every sector of our society, whether that's government, politics, business, the third sector, and that's what I'm seeking to lead as First Minister. And we've got to take head on some of the arguments that are used against gender equality, like, oh, but people should only be there on merit. Of course people should only be there on merit, but women are 52% of the population. The time when merit should become an issue for you is when you've got organisations that don't have 50-50, because that suggests that the talent of the country is not properly being utilised. I tell this story quite a lot, but when I appointed the Gender Balance Cabinet, in the days afterwards, I got quite a lot of letters about it. From men and women, I have to say, but some of them were asking me how I knew all the women in my cabinet were there on merit. Not a single one asked me how I knew all the men in my cabinet were there on merit. Incidentally, they're all there on merit.
We've got a question here, and then somebody down here has had her hand up for a long time. Yes.
Going back to a few weeks before the referendum and the moment when financial institutions and certain big businesses in the supermarkets issued certain threats, and it became very apparent that there was pressure coming from that side. And given in the last year the fluctuations over oil, there is an unpalatable fact that although it's your job, of course, to lead us to be as rich a country as we can be, perhaps in the future, perhaps because of environmental crisis or because of issues around world movement of people, we may just have to be a poorer country. And we may actually have to make choices as individuals that lead to us making decisions that for a just society, we have to pay more. And I think that can be an allowable question to the population. Say, would you be willing to pay more for a just society? I know I would be, and I think many people on middle incomes actually believe enough in the future to say that they would. Can that be a nettle that is grasped to actually say that it's not always about becoming richer, it's actually about making decisions out of your own pocket to have a better country?
Yeah, I mean, your question, is that an allowable question? Of course it is. These are debates that were certainly prevalent in the independence campaign, and I'm sure will continue to be so. And I guess there's two different sort of issues there. Do we have to accept that we should be a poorer country? I don't believe we do. All countries will go through ups and downs, but I believe that Scotland has all of the raw materials and all of the skill and ingenuity to be a prosperous country in the future if we use the materials and the decision-making powers that we've got wisely. The second bit of your question is how that wealth is then distributed and who pays what towards the services that we all rely on. And I'm pretty sure that debate will be at the heart of our own election in May, and will continue to be at the heart of the political debate in future. And it's certainly one I don't shy away from, and it's one that I'm sure the SNP will bring our thoughts to bear on, as well as other parties in that.
Yes.
Hello, First Minister.
Hello.
I was delighted to read in your manifesto that you are not in favour of the government changing the disability benefit over to PIP. As you know, ATOS assess people and their tendency is to cut off people's benefits and then see how hard they can fight to get them back, regardless of their medical evidence. And some people even die of their conditions before they get to the tribunals, which is not uncommon. And
can I press you for a question, because
I'm
there are
sorry.
lots of people
I'm
who
sorry.
Want to,
Yes.
who want to get
sorry.
in.
So I was wondering, what are you going to be able to do anything in the near future in order to help these people?
I hope so. I fervently hope that that will be the case. Some of the limited social security powers that the Scottish Parliament will take over at some point over the next few years, it's not certain yet exactly when that will be around disability benefits, and I absolutely hope that we'll be able to improve the situation for people with disabilities. Obviously, in parallel to the legislation that will deliver those powers is the discussion about the resource that is transferred to us to allow us to implement them. I called post-referendum and the UK government to halt the move to PIP because it brings with it, I think, a £3 billion cut in support for people with disabilities across the UK. Now, where we have been able to already, as a devolved government, have sought to mitigate the worst impacts of welfare cuts. So we can't abolish the bedroom tax yet because we don't have the power to do it, although as soon as we do, we will abolish the bedroom tax. But in the meantime, we're providing the money to councils so that nobody has to feel the impact of the bedroom tax. I very much want us to be able to improve carers allowance, for example, and to look at how we improve support for people with disabilities, which is fundamentally about the financial support people receive, but also around employability support, so that where people are able to work or to do voluntary work, they get much more support to get into those kinds of areas. So that's, a very real example that takes the argument about more powers out of the abstract and puts it into real life for many people. What the UK government right now is doing to people with disabilities in terms of just simply cutting vital support from them is unconscionable in my view. And, it makes me very angry when I see the people who come to my surgeries.
We've got 5 minutes left, so I'll take a question from William Dalrymple.
What do you make of Jeremy Corbyn, and do you think he's got what it takes to revive Labour?
Jack McConnell suddenly disappeared from the room. I'm not sure if that was as a result of that question. You know what? I'm not sure anybody's got what it takes to revive Labour, but thankfully that's not my problem. It's not for me to say. What I think the leadership election in Labour is demonstrating is the exact opposite of what much of the media in England tried to tell us during the election campaign. Contrary to what was put across, that people in England were terrified of the SNP or any prospect of the SNP, my experience during that campaign, and actually what I would argue you're seeing now in the Labour leadership election, is that there is a massive appetite for change in England as well. People just want something different. They want to know that we're not going to constantly be in a cycle of doing the same things over and over and over again and getting the same results. They want to know that the country has a government that acts for the many, not for the few. And I think that's what's driving Jeremy Corbyn's campaign and his apparent success in that campaign, although we'll wait and see what the outcome is. And I have to say, some of what's happening in response to that, it just seems to me, it's a bit like what the Yes campaign got thrown at it by the establishment. They're doing the same to Jeremy Corbyn, and I suspect rather than having their desired effect, it's just serving to increase and intensify the support that he's got. I have to say, not that Tony Blair will ever want to listen to advice from me, but I would have thought if Tony Blair had really wanted to stop Jeremy Corbyn in his tracks, then instead of making a speech opposing him, he should actually have endorsed him. And that would have stopped him dead in his tracks.
There are lots and lots of hands up. I'm sorry I'm not going to get to everybody, but in the interest of gender balance, having taken a question from a man, I'm going to take a question from this lady here.
Hi there. I'm very, very nervous, so I feel really trembling, but there are loads of things I would like to speak about and very little time, so I'm just sticking to one. We are talking about rich countries and economy that works, but what does it mean to be a rich country? Is it just about money? Is it just about finances? And now in this country, we have David Cameron that is pushing so hard to have fracking coming in again, something that they think it's an easy resource to take out of this earth, with all the damage that has been proved already in many other countries that fracking has been doing to community, health, water, environment. Do we really want to go down those lines? What are we prepared to do here in Scotland? It doesn't seem to be the right way to go. It's again like following oil, which we see the consequences of drilling out oil in the sea, in other, even from the earth. Do we want to do that with gas? It just seems horrific. You know, the whole idea of just going, basically cracking the stones to get this gas out. What can we do to stop it? Because they're really pushing hard. And that frightens me.
Okay. Well, it's exactly because of all of the concerns that you've just articulated that the Scottish Government is not taking the same approach to fracking as the UK Government is, which just appears to be going hell for leather regardless of the concerns or any of the evidence around the health implications or the environmental implications. So right now, we have a moratorium on any consents for fracking being granted in Scotland while we do deeper work into the consequences of it. So we're preparing to do environmental studies, a health impact assessment, and to consult much more with public opinion before we take a final view. You don't look nervous to me right now, I have to say, but you come on before.
Because I'm not a scientist, but what I understood from my life and my experiences that I had is that we don't need any more research. We don't need to spend...
Okay.
Wait. We don't need to spend money in that. It's obvious.
Okay.
Let's listen to the people that are telling us they damage our community, our health. We don't need to let these people to go and trying to come up with their solution.
Okay,
It's like
thank you.
nuclear
Thank you very much.
energy is not safe. Yeah. We know it. We can't contain it.
Okay.
I think, look, I hugely admire your passion on this, and I think there are aspects around the debate on fracking that we don't know all of the answers to. There's also, and I have to be perfectly honest here, most times when fracking is raised with me, it's raised by people of your point of view. But sometimes, I get people raising it with me who take the opposite view. So I think as a government, we do have an obligation to look at these things in an evidence-based and systematic way. That's what we're doing. And we'll come to a view in the round with public opinion taken account of as part of that once we've done that work. In the meantime, we will not allow fracking to happen in Scotland. Now, I know, to go back where we started and Alan talking about, damned if you do, damned if you don't. That's the nature of government. I know that position doesn't satisfy everybody, but in my judgment, that's the right approach to take, an evidence-based approach that will lead to, whatever it might be, the right decision in the longer term.
Somebody is holding up a big placard there with the word finish on it, so I'm sorry. It's aimed at me, by the way, not at Nicola. So I'm not going to take any more questions from the floor. I'm very sorry to those of you who've had your hands up for a long time, like the gentleman there. But I do want to finish with a quick Beyond Borders question. What we do here every August under Mark Murrow-Stewart's guidance is talk about how Scotland can join in a global dialogue, what a small devolved country like Scotland can be part of a much larger dialogue in cultural diplomacy, in the promotion of human rights, in conflict resolution and so on. Do you have any, what is your view about what is possible for Scotland as it, not as an independent, I'm not going to ask you to imagine you're Prime Minister of an independent country, but as First Minister of a devolved country within the UK?
I think there is a lot possible for Scotland here. I mean, I've just been having a discussion with Mark and some colleagues involved in this area about the reality that the countries that do most around conflict prevention and mediation are actually small countries. And therefore, I think there is huge scope for Scotland to do more as, you know, a host country for mediation efforts. But I tell you one area where, and it comes back to much of what we've been discussing here today, where we can bring to the table something that gives us, in the whole area of conflict resolution and mediation, enormous credibility, and that is our own experience. What we did in the referendum last year was debate and decide a massive constitutional issue that in many parts of the world would have led to incredible bloodshed and violence and conflict. We did it entirely peacefully. Now, that gives us real life experience to bring to bear there. So, as I've said to Mark, I'm very keen as First Minister to look at how we do more and the areas in which we might best bring that contribution to bear. But there is massive potential for us as a small country to be a massive voice for peace in the world.